You need to prime your model. Well, do you actually? I mean, there are quite a few ways to do it, and I'd say at least a couple of good reasons why you should, but there's also tons of issues that can come with priming, that it may feel like the whole idea is just one big con. Rough textures, paint that doesn't stick, detail obstruction, always needing the right temperature, or expensive equipment. What a hassle! And for what? Well, I'll tell you what, and how. In this video, I want to explain why I prefer to prime my miniatures, but then also explain 3 different ways to do it, from painting it on, spray can, and airbrush. First, of course, we need something to prime, and for that I've got some blessed sisters from this month's one-page rules sci-fi offering. There's a couple of hero models with the witch and the canoness, some heavy firepower with the support sisters, some sleek, sister-piloted exosuits, and a huge battle tank. I'll use some of these support sisters to demonstrate priming in this video because usually smaller models with hard to reach areas, like behind big bulky weapons, are the hardest to prime. This is the big question really. Why do we prime at all? If you have a really sticky paint like an acrylic gouache, you really don't need to. These things are made to cling to any surface. They're even difficult to get off the palette. But even though I do use paints like that, I still prime my miniatures. Because first and foremost for me is I like to use my primer as my first color. So often I'll mix in another paint to give my blacks a certain tone, like blue or red, because the colors I'm going to build up later will benefit from this undercoat. It's the same reason we zenithal prime, for a good underlayer. My other big reason for it is finish. The painting surface that you get really does matter when it comes to how paints like to behave as you paint them on. With a matte finish, paint stays exactly where you put it, even when a bit too watered down, which is why I prefer to prime in matte because I like having that control. A glossy or satin finish acts more like a slide, which can be a boon if you want washes or contrast to really sink into the depths compared to a matte surface. So if using the contrast method, I think a gloss prime will actually give a more satisfactory result. Bare resin and plastic also have a hydrophobic property, sometimes, and it's one of the reasons you really want to spray something on beforehand. It doesn't even have to be a primer. A matte varnish will give you a better painting surface even if it doesn't give any color. The last reason is for protecting the model. Though in the case of 3D printing, it can help protect us too. When it comes to resin models, even after giving them their suntan, there may be places with only partly polymerized resin. It's not going anywhere if it was cleaned properly, but it is only about 30% cured or so versus the 70% of a properly cured resin. Basically the difference between dark and light resin here. A coat of primer will just make sure that the brushes aren't touching those only partly polymerized surfaces. When it comes to the case of protecting the mini from paint rubbing off, I think that's the lowest rung of concern, especially when using things like hobby holders. Plus, a varnish at the end will lock things in more securely. So now that you've got my why, let me show you my how. This is the method that spurred me to make this video, because I don't think it's ever been shown in any detail, but is valid for getting miniatures started. And if someone lives in a small space, or it's the time of year when it's just not feasible to prime outside, then this might be the only option. The first thing to consider is which brush-on primer to use. I like Green Stuff Worlds for various reasons, but this is more about the how than the which. So whichever is available to you and you like is fine. Next is a brush. You want something large-ish with a point, but not one of the good ones. I'm going to use one of my good quality, but still cheaper, synthetics for this. Now the gut reaction might be to just put lots of primer on the model, really bathe it in, so that it gets a full thick coverage. And while this primer will tighten up and shrink to form on the model, it'll pool, which could cause air bubbles getting trapped and obscure finer, shallower details. If we remember back to the reasons for priming, surface, color, and protection, in my testing I found it best to focus on getting a nice surface rather than a full color. So I'll actually thin it out with some water and put on a really thin layer. It won't cover the resin perfectly, but it will give a great surface to paint base coats on, which will cover the resin, and will let that base coat color stick to the model much more evenly. It can take a little longer to apply than just pouring it on, but I think it'll be worth it to have that canvas-like surface to paint on. I don't spray can primer much anymore, but when it comes to doing a lot of models really quick, there's not much that beats it. Even an airbrush isn't going to do spray can volumes, at least not as fast. But there are a few things to watch out for to really get the best results. Like with the brush-on primers, there's so many to choose from that I'm just going to leave it up to you again. I will say though that to me, more important than its primer qualities are its finish. So I want something matte. So something like this 2-in-1 paint and primer from the hardware store is good enough for me because as long as it sticks to the model, I'm not worried about how well it protects. That's what the varnish is for later. So the first thing is to shake the heck out of this, like way more than a few back and forths. While it's not the worst thing in the world if you don't, sometimes just more shaking will fix issues before they happen. Second is to give it a spray into the air to empty the internal mechanisms of the unshaken paint with the shaken stuff, especially if this is an already used can. Now we can start spraying our models. First though is it's best to get a holder or some kind of stand so that we're not spraying our hand, which should have a glove. Something like a paint stirrer from a hardware store is the perfect size and width for multiple models without obscuring the underside of them, which I'll tell you why that's important in a bit. There's actually going to be a few things on this label that are going to tell you how to do it that we should probably ignore. First is anything that says you need 2 coats. You're about to put at least 3 or 4 more coats of paint and contrast on those models. So unless you want no detail, 1 is fine. Second is the distance to hold it from the models. It'll say a foot away is great, if you like wasting paint and getting no coverage. I like to hold it much closer because I can use the force of the paint coming out to make sure it gets into all the small details and more of the actual spray hits the model. Also never continuous spray, just do it in bursts. Continuous is also going to waste your paint and is a surefire way to put on too much as well. Now we can talk about how to get a good solid coverage. First we'll start from below the models. This is why being able to get under them is important, because this is the angle that is always hardest to catch. So by doing it first, we catch all those hard to reach places without ending up with double or triple coats on the easy to reach places. Then we head to the opposite side and get the model above from about an 85-degree angle. This will fill in most of what we missed by spraying from the bottom. Now what we have is a mostly primed model where we can see exactly what was missed. So aim for the spots that need that coverage and it'll be completely covered from every angle, without any lost detail from too much spray. I've done airbrush priming on my channel before, so instead of just repeating myself here about tack coats and consistency, links below, instead I'll espouse more about its unique ability to generate a gamut of colors. After the tack coat with a proper primer, this surface we're left with becomes pretty acceptable to pretty much any paint. So while the coverage is not there, what we have is something we can apply any color to get the coverage and starting color. In this case, I want to go with a nice gold, but something a bit darker than a retributor spray you can get in a can. So I'm going with a Viking gold and brown ink. A dark start so I can eventually brighten it up. Metal and ink though are notoriously hard to run through an airbrush, so my solution is usually to replace the binders they come in, which tend to be the issue, with a smoother satin medium and an airbrush thinner. It will dilute them out, but make them flow better, so I can just do a few layers to actually build up the color. So with just my primer layer, I've got about 70% of my base coats done too. That's the power of airbrush priming, and one that should be taken advantage of when you can. I'd also like to take the opportunity to announce that I've started my own Patreon. Right now I have 2 long-form paint-along videos that anyone can watch for free as an example of one of the perks backers will be getting. Each month I'll be doing Q&A streams, polls, ad-free videos, and exclusive paint-along videos with a model everyone can access for free from other Patreons or, hopefully with enough support, exclusive STLs. So I'll leave a link in the description for everyone to check out. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe if you like this video, and check the link in the description to my Discord where I talk all sorts of nonsense about miniatures painting, provide critique on paint jobs, and occasionally stream.